Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. On this episode, we're talking about ESG and supply chain with a focus on recent developments in litigation risk. And our guest today is Liz Cassidy, commercial litigation partner at Steptoe and a core member of Steptoe's ESG team. So Liz, thanks so much for joining us, and we're really excited to have you here at Supply Chain University.
Thank you for having me, Jeff.
So before we dive into the discussion, I was wondering whether you could give us a brief overview of what ESG means.
Sure, yes, a good place to start. So ESG stands for environment, social, and governance. And there are several factors that fall within each category. So for example, environment includes things like climate change risk, greenhouse gas reporting, circular economy, environmental impact, and environmental justice. Social includes labor and human rights, including in supply chains, workplace safety and culture, diversity, equity, inclusion, consumer protection, and pay equity. And governance can include corporate reporting and ESG disclosures, board structure and composition, data privacy and cybersecurity, executive comp and stockholder rights. And those are just kind of some of the principal core ESG factors. There's other things that are included as well. But overall, ESG is seen as a catalyst for long-term value creation and performance, which is why you're hearing so much about it, which I think is you're going to get to.
Right. Yeah, no, it's pretty broad coverage there. So why do you think we're hearing so much about it?
Yeah, so an interesting feature of ESG is that it's being driven by many different stakeholders, not just regulators. So for example, investors are focused on ESG. They're looking at companies' ESG strategy and performance prior to investing in a company. It's become, a type of due diligence that investors are doing. Shareholders are also very focused on ESG. It's been reported that 90% of S&P 500 companies published some type of ESG statement in 2020, and that was expected to increase last year in 2021. And shareholders are increasingly voting against directors that they believe have failed to adequately oversee ESG risk. And employees are also focused on ESG. We've heard a lot in the last couple of years about the Great Resignation. And the two, they're not totally intertwined, but there's some overlap there. Employees are looking at the corporate culture and how, what employee policies are and a company's practices and procedures around ESG and whether a company, is being sustainable. And also consumers are making buying choices based on ESG factors. Obviously, some of the most important or the most focused on there are, again, sustainability and climate change risk. And of course, regulators are focused on ESG as well. So the SEC proposed rule on climate-related disclosure just came out in March. It was long anticipated, but it did come out at the end of March, and it's about 510 pages. If adopted, it's going to require public companies to disclose certain climate-related information in their registration statements and annual reports, and it will meaningfully increase the cost and complexity of public reporting on these issues. Of course, many companies prior to the SEC rule were already making voluntary disclosures about climate change risk and other ESG factors. But also following the SEC proposed rule, the FDIC issued its own climate disclosure proposed rule for FDIC insured banks, and regulators in the EU have proposed new climate-related disclosure obligations as well. And Jeff, one thing I will point out is the EU is ahead in many ways with respect to ESG issues.
Yep, and that's not surprising, given my interactions with them on chemicals issues and other types of issues in the environmental space. So as a commercial litigator, why have you focused part of your practice on ESG?
Yeah, I mean, aside from having, some personal interest in it, just from seeing it and reading and learning more about it, I do represent a lot of clients in the financial services space. And I have my background is in handling securities and fraud cases, among many others, but have a long history of handling securities cases. And as companies started making voluntary disclosures about their ESG commitments and sustainability, I recognize that as a litigator that there's litigation risk there. Anytime a company starts touting its performance or, making statements. There's always a risk that the plaintiff's bar is going to latch onto that. And another part of my practice involves employment litigation and investigations. And so the Me Too movement and social justice movements recently have led to an increased awareness, but also litigation over ESG related issues. And that, these kind of fall into the S, if you will, within ESG. This highlights again, just how important it is for companies to have an integrated ESG strategy, and then that it makes sense for legal to be involved, because when you have companies, making statements about ESG commitments, you should have your legal department involved as well, and making sure you have a comprehensive strategy and approach.
So, in addition to the proposed regulations and the obligations you mentioned, what are some other recent developments in the ESG space that companies should be aware of?
Yeah, it does seem like, Jeff, there's new developments every day. There's so much going on in this space. And as we've just talked about, it's very broad. But just to touch on a couple, so kind of within my world, greenwashing and sustainability litigation remains kind of at the forefront. The plaintiffs' bars brought lawsuits alleging that operating companies, so including companies in the oil and gas, mining, and consumer goods sectors, are making misleading statements and claims about the climate friendliness of their operations or the products that they manufacture. For example, a recent lawsuit in the Southern District of New York against Oatly, which was an oatmeal company, claiming that they made false and misleading statements about their sustainability. That case was dismissed. I will say, there haven't been many successes yet in bringing these types of lawsuits, but it certainly can be time intensive and a burden to litigate them, regardless of whether you're able to get them dismissed at the pleading stage. And then another recent one, which was in the Eastern District of New York, was alleging security claims that a mining accident demonstrated a Brazilian mining company's that their sustainability and safety claims were misleading. And ultimately that case has settled. And then there's also been increased allegations that many funds with sustainable or green investments are not living up to their name and promises because their portfolio holdings are not sufficiently aligned with specific standards addressed for climate change. So that's another area that we're keeping an eye on, or I'm keeping an eye on. And also allegations concerning companies' commitments to their DE&I and board diversity, statements they've made about increasing board diversity and DE&I. So lots of interesting things going on. It's an interesting space, and there's certainly more to come.
Yeah, and I think, thank you so much for providing that overview. This definitely, I feel like I'm seeing the same thing in the trade space in terms of the Uyghur Act, for instance, on forced labor and the potential carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU. We're getting a lot more inquiries about ESG issues from clients, and it sounds like it's really just across the board. Really appreciate your coming on and hearing your insights on these issues.
I thank you for having me on. And like you said at the outset, we have a team here at Steptoe. I think this is an area that really is cross practice and touches on a lot of different areas. So look forward to speaking with you again in the future. I'm sure there's lots more to come, but also from our other colleagues as well who have been focused on this space.
Yeah, and looking forward to those. And I should mention, I joined the ESG team as well, because I feel like I'm spending a lot more time in that space too. And it's very clear these issues are only going to, remain front and center for companies and likely grow in importance. And we hope that you'll come on the show periodically and update us on where things are headed and what companies need to focus on in terms of litigation risk. So thanks again so much for being here.
Thanks a lot, Jeff.
And that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this and all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll see you next time.